Four thieves crept into the Leavitt mansion, certain it was empty. Their flashlights slicing through the dark, they laughed, thinking Karoline Leavitt was just a rich man's wife, far away on some lavish trip. But Karoline was there, watching from a hidden room, her fingers on a system she'd built herself. If you've ever been underestimated because you seemed ordinary, this is for you. Why did they think they could outsmart her? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The night hung heavy over Long Island, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Vince, a wiry man with a scar above his left eyebrow, stood outside the Leavitt mansion, his breath fogging in the chilly air. He grinned at his crew, Jenna and Gary, his voice low and smug. Rich folks like these, they're halfway across the world by now. The mansion loomed dark, its windows like blank eyes, and Vince was sure it was empty. He clipped the power line with a quick snip, plunging the estate into shadow. What he didn't see was the tiny red light of a backup camera, winking to life in the corner of the porch. Inside, Karoline Leavitt sat in a hidden room, her face lit by the soft glow of a dozen monitors. Her fingers rested on a touchscreen, steady, but her heart thumped with something fiercer than fear. Karoline was alone, or so the world thought. The thieves didn't know her name, didn't know she was Victor Leavitt's wife, didn't know she'd spent years turning this house into a fortress. To them, she was just a shadow they'd never meet. Vince's crowbar scraped against the back door's lock, the sound sharp in the silence. Easiest score we'll ever make, he chuckled. And Jenna, clutching an empty duffel bag, nodded, her eyes darting nervously. Al and Gary flanked her, their flashlights cutting through the dark, catching the glint of a chandelier through a window. They were hungry for this. Years of scraping by had made them bold, reckless even. But Karoline watched every step, her jaw tight, her calm exterior hiding a storm. If you've ever been underestimated because you seemed alone, this story's for you. She'd been underestimated before, not just tonight, but years ago, when people saw her as nothing more than a quiet wife, a footnote to her husband's tech empire. They didn't know she'd studied engineering, didn't know she'd designed the very system now tracking these intruders. Her eyes flicked to a silver locket on the desk, its surface worn from years of touch. It held a photo of her mother, the woman who taught her to stand firm, to build instead of break. Karoline's fingers twitched, hovering over a button labeled alert. She could end this now, call the police, and be done. But something held her back, not fear, but a need to see this through, to protect what was hers in her own way. Outside, Vince popped the lock, the door creaking open. "We're in," he whispered, his voice thick with triumph. The crew slipped inside, their boots soft on the marble floor. They didn't hear the faint hum of the system rebooting, didn't see the cameras adjusting to follow them. Karoline leaned closer to her screens, her breath slow and deliberate. These people thought her home was just a prize, something to take because they could. They didn't know it was her sanctuary, built to hold memories no money could replace. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't fight to win. You fight to keep what matters." The foyer was grand, all polished stone and high ceilings. But the thieves didn't pause to admire it. Jenna's flashlight swept over a family portrait, and for a moment, her gaze lingered on Karoline's face, a flicker of unease crossing her own. "Move it," Vince snapped, and she shook it off, following him deeper. Al muttered about grabbing silverware, Gary about checking the safe. They were so sure of themselves, so certain no one was watching. But Karoline was there, her presence silent, unyielding. She pressed a button, and a single light flickered on in the hallway ahead, just enough to draw their eyes. Vince froze, his grin fading. "What was that?" he hissed, his flashlight darting around. Jenna clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "Probably nothing," Al said, but his voice shook. They didn't know it yet, but they'd stepped into a trap, one Karoline had spent years perfecting. She wasn't just guarding a house, she was guarding her life, her grief, her strength, and she wasn't about to let them take it. The air felt heavier now, the silence not so empty anymore. What was that light, and why did it feel like the house was watching them? The Leavitt mansion felt like a cathedral in the dark, its high ceiling swallowing the faint echoes of the thieves' footsteps. Karoline sat in her hidden control room, a small space tucked behind a false wall, her eyes fixed on the grainy feed of her monitors. Each screen showed a different angle of the intruders, Vince leading with a swagger, Jenna clutching her empty duffel bag, Al and Gary trailing with flashlights that bobbed like fireflies. Karoline's breath was steady, but her chest felt heavy, weighed down by a memory she couldn't shake. On her desk, a silver locket caught the dim light, its surface etched with her mother's initials, a quiet tether to the woman who'd taught her to build, to endure, to protect. She hadn't opened it in years, but its presence grounded her, a reminder of why this house was more than walls and wealth. Vince's voice cut through the silence, low and bitter as he swept his flashlight across the foyer. "These people don't deserve this kind of money," he muttered, his beam lingering on a crystal chandelier that sparkled faintly. Jenna nodded, but her steps slowed as she passed a family portrait on the wall. Karoline's face stared back from the canvas, her expression calm, almost serene, next to her husband Victor and their daughter. Long grown and moved away, Jenna's brow furrowed, a flicker of recognition she couldn't place. "Hurry up," Vince snapped, and she shook her head, moving on. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, sharp and sudden, then fell silent, as if it sensed something the thieves couldn't. Karoline's fingers hovered over a button labeled lockdown, her pulse quickening, not from fear but from the weight of what was coming. She hadn't always been this vigilant. Years ago, when she was just a young engineer, people had looked at her and seen only a woman with big dreams and a quiet voice. They didn't see the hours she'd spent coding, designing systems that could outthink any thief. They didn't see the nights she'd stayed up after her mother's death, turning grief into steel, building this house into a sanctuary no one could breach. Victor had believed in her, had given her the resources to create this masterpiece, but even he didn't know the full extent of what she'd built. This wasn't just a security system, it was her defiance, her way of saying the world couldn't take what she'd fought to keep. And now, these strangers were trampling through her home, thinking it was theirs for the taking. Vince led the group deeper, his crowbar dangling at his side, his confidence unshaken. "Check the office first," he said, pointing toward a hallway lined with oak doors. Al muttered something about silverware, Gary about a safe he'd heard rich folks always had. They moved like they owned the place, their voices casual, almost bored. But Jenna lagged behind, her flashlight lingering on small details, a child's drawing framed on the wall, a worn book left open on a side table. "This feels lived in," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Vince snorted, "So what, they're not here?" But Jenna's unease grew, a knot in her stomach she couldn't explain. She didn't know Karoline was watching, didn't know every word was being recorded, every step catalogued. Karoline's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted a camera, zooming in on Jenna's face. There was something in the woman's hesitation, A crack in the group's bravado that made Karoline pause. She could lock them in now, trap them like rats. But she didn't. Not yet. This wasn't just about stopping them. It was about showing them they'd underestimated her, just like so many others had. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft but firm. You don't fight to hurt, Karoline. You fight to protect. She glanced at the locket again, its weight a quiet anchor. These thieves weren't just stealing objects, they were stealing her peace, her safety, the life she'd built from ashes, and that she couldn't allow. Outside, the night stayed quiet. The neighbor's dog no longer stirring. A faint breeze rustled the trees, carrying the distant hum of a car on the highway. The thieves moved toward the office, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Unaware of the walls that would soon close in, Karoline's finger rested on the lockdown button. Her heart steady now, her resolve like iron. She wasn't just a rich man's wife, wasn't just a shadow in this house. She was its architect, its guardian. And these intruders had no idea what they'd walked into. Jenna stopped again, her light catching on a small plaque by the office door, engraved with a name she couldn't quite read. Why did it feel like the house was holding its breath? The Leavitt mansion's grand hallway felt smaller now, its walls pressing in as the thieves stood frozen under the sudden glow of overhead lights. Vince's flashlight dropped to his side, his face twisting with irritation as he kicked at the oak door they'd just passed through. It didn't budge, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in the silence. Damn generator, he growled, but his voice lacked the confidence it held minutes ago. Karoline watched from her control room, her fingers steady on the touchscreen, her heart pounding not with fear but with the weight of what she was doing. She'd pressed the button to trigger the first phase of her trap, and now the house was alive, its systems humming softly, like a beast stirring from sleep. The silver locket on her desk glinted, a quiet reminder of why she couldn't let these intruders win. Jenna's breath hitched as she spun around, her flashlight catching the glint of a camera lens swiveling in the corner. Someone's watching us, she whispered, her voice trembling, her duffel bag slipping from her shoulder to the floor. Al, the youngest of the group, shoved at another door, his broad shoulders heaving. What the hell is this? He stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. Gary, quieter than the others, stood still, his eyes darting between the locked doors and the camera. This isn't right, he muttered, his fingers tightening around his flashlight. Vince, still clinging to control, shouted into the empty air, "Show yourself, coward." But the only answer was the faint hum of the mansion's systems, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Karoline leaned closer to her monitors, her jaw tight, her pulse a steady drumbeat. She wasn't just protecting a house, she was protecting her life, her memories, the sanctuary she'd built after years of being underestimated. She'd been called soft, ornamental, just a rich man's wife. But those who knew her really knew her understood the steel beneath her quiet demeanor. Her mother had taught her that strength wasn't loud, that it lay in preparation, in resolve. And tonight, that resolve was her weapon. She adjusted a camera, zooming in on Vince's face, his bravado cracking like thin ice. He thought he was in charge, thought this was his game. But this was her house, her rules, and they'd walked right into her maze. Outside, across the street, a neighbor named Ellen peered through her curtains, her phone pressed to her ear as she whispered to a 911 operator. "Something's happening at the Leavitt place," she said, her voice low, uncertain. She'd seen the flashlights, heard the faint clatter of the break-in, but she hesitated, unsure if she should get involved. Karoline was a private woman, rarely seen outside her home, and Ellen didn't know her well. Still, something about the scene felt wrong, like the night itself was holding its breath. She stayed quiet, watching, her finger hovering over the phone's end call button. If you've ever stood by, unsure whether to act, this moment is for you. Inside, the thieves' movements grew frantic. Jenna backed against a wall, her eyes wide as she scanned the ceiling for more cameras. "This isn't just a house," she said, her voice barely audible. It's like a trap." Vince spun on her, his face red. "Shut up. Jenna, it's just a glitch. Some fancy system. We'll find a way out." But his words sounded hollow. Even to himself, Al pounded on another door, his fists leaving faint marks on the polished wood. "We're locked in," he shouted, his voice breaking. Gary, still silent, stepped toward the hallway's end, where a faint light flickered, as if inviting them deeper. "Maybe there's a way out there," he said, but his tone carried no hope. Karoline's heart raced now, not from fear but from the weight of her choice. She could end this, unlock the doors, let the police handle it, walk away. But these people hadn't just broken into her home. They'd violated her peace, her safety, the place where she'd rebuilt herself after loss. Her mother's locket seemed to pulse under the control room's dim light, urging her to act. She pressed another button, and the hallway lights dimmed, replaced by a single spotlight at the far end, illuminating a door that hadn't been there before. It was a decoy, part of her system's design, leading to a reinforced room with no exit. She whispered to herself, "You picked the wrong house," her voice steady, a vow to herself as much as to them. The thieves hesitated, their flashlights converging on the new door. Vince's eyes narrowed, his confidence flickering back. "See, told you. There's always a way out." He strode toward it, the others trailing reluctantly. Jenna's gaze lingered on the camera, her unease growing into something sharper, something like fear. She didn't know who was watching, didn't know why the house felt alive, but she sensed they were no longer in control. Outside, Ellen's phone call connected, and a police dispatcher's voice crackled through. "Units are on the way," the voice said, but Ellen didn't reply. Her eyes fixed on the mansion. The spotlight in the hallway flickered, and the air grew heavier. Who was behind this, and what did they want? The Leavitt mansion's hallway felt like a cage now, the air thick with the thieves' rising panic. The spotlight Karoline had triggered cast long shadows, making the polished wood walls seem to close in. Vince stood frozen, his crowbar slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor, the sound sharp against the silence that followed her voice. "This is my house. You're the intruders," Karoline had said, her words cold, measured, slicing through the dark like a blade. In her control room, she sat motionless, her eyes locked on the monitors, her fingers resting lightly on the touchscreen. The silver locket on her desk gleamed faintly, its weight anchoring her to the memory of her mother, to the resolve that had built this unyielding system. Her heart beat steadily, but there was a fire in her chest, a quiet fury at these strangers who thought they could take what was hers. Jenna's whisper broke the tension, her voice trembling as she clutched her empty duffel bag. "That's Karoline Leavitt, Victor Leavitt's wife." The name landed like a thunderbolt, heavy with meaning. Victor Leavitt, the tech mogul whose security systems were the stuff of legend, untouchable, unbreakable. Al let out a nervous laugh, his broad shoulders hunching as he backed against a wall. "No way she's here," he said, his voice cracking. "It's gotta be a recording, some automated crap," but his words sounded hollow, even to himself. Gary, the quiet one, said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the swiveling camera above them. He'd seen tech like this before, years ago, during a heist that had landed him in jail. The memory made his stomach twist. This wasn't just a rich woman's toy, this was something else. Caroline's next move erased Al's doubt. A flat screen mounted in the hallway flickered to life, its glow harsh against the dim light. The thieves turned, their flashlights converging on the image-live footage of themselves, standing in that very hallway. Time-stamped seconds ago. Vince's face, red with anger, filled the screen. His mouth half open in mid-shout. Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She's watching us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gary's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "This is Leavitt Tech," he muttered, his voice low, urgent. "She didn't just buy this system, she built it." The truth hit them like a wave, eroding the last of their confidence. Karoline wasn't a bystander, wasn't just a name on a portrait. She was the mind behind this trap. Vince shook his head, his fists clenching as he shouted at the ceiling, "You're bluffing. You hear me, you're not here." But doubt crept into his voice, a tremor that betrayed his bravado. He'd planned this heist for weeks, studied the mansion's layout, confirmed the Leavitts were supposed to be overseas. He'd been so sure, so certain no one would stop them. But now, standing in this locked hallway, under the unblinking eye of a camera, he felt small, exposed. Jenna's gaze darted between the screen and the locked door, her breathing shallow. "What if she's really here?" she asked, her voice breaking. Al snorted, but it was forced, his hands trembling as he gripped his flashlight. "She's not," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Outside, the faint wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing closer, a distant promise of consequences. Ellen, the neighbor across the street, stood at her window, her phone still pressed to her ear. She told the 911 operator about the flashlights, the noises, but now she hesitated, watching the mansion's lights flicker through the trees. "They're saying it's the Leavitt place," the operator said, and Ellen nodded absently, her mind racing. She'd always thought of Karoline as a quiet woman, someone who kept to herself, not someone who could orchestrate. This, if you've ever wondered what it's like to be underestimated until the truth comes out, this moment is for you. Karoline's fingers moved across the touchscreen, her movements precise, deliberate. She could lock them in the decoy room now, end this with a single command. But she waited, her eyes narrowing as she studied their faces on the monitors. Vince's anger, Jenna's fear, Al's denial, Gary's dawning realization they were unraveling, and she wanted them to feel it, to know they'd misjudged her. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft but unyielding. "You don't fight to prove yourself, Karoline. You fight to protect what's yours." She'd spent years building this system, not for glory, but for safety, for the life she'd carved out after loss. These thieves thought her home was just a prize, something to plunder because they could. They didn't know it was her fortress, her legacy, her defiance against a world that had once tried to break her. The screen in the hallway flickered again, now showing a loop of their break-in the moment Vince cut the power. The crowbar prying the door, their careless steps into the foyer. The timestamp was undeniable, the footage clear. Jenna's face paled, her duffel bag slipping to the floor. "She's got everything," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Gary stepped back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We're done," he said, his voice flat, final. Vince spun on him, his face contorted. "No one's done. We get out. We disappear," but his shout echoed weakly, swallowed by the mansion's vastness. The sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the night like a warning. Karoline's voice didn't return, but her presence was everywhere in the cameras, the locks, the screen that held their guilt. The thieves stood under the spotlight, their shadows long and jagged, and for the first time, they felt like prey. What would she do next? The Leavitt mansion's hallway was a prison of light now. Thin red laser beams crisscrossing the air like a spider's web, pinning the thieves in a tight circle. The glow cast jagged shadows on the polished wood floor, making their faces look gaunt, hunted. Vince's bravado had crumbled, his hands trembling as he clutched his flashlight, his voice hoarse from shouting. "We'll get out," he yelled. But the words sounded more like a plea than a promise. Karoline watched from her control room, her fingers steady on the touchscreen, the silver locket on her desk a quiet anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Her heart wasn't racing anymore, it was calm, resolute, fueled by the need to protect her home, her memories, her life. She'd activated the laser grid with a single tap, a system she'd designed herself, and now the thieves were caught, their every move hers to command. Jenna stood pale and trembling, her duffel bag forgotten at her feet, her eyes darting between the glowing beams. "She's been watching us the whole time," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder would make it more real. Ella, his broad shoulders slumped, dropped his crowbar, the metal clattering loudly against the floor. Vince spun on him, his face contorted with rage. "What are you doing?" he hissed. But Al just shook his head, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm not dying for this," he said, his voice low, defeated. Gary, the quiet one, stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the camera above, its lens glinting like an unblinking eye. He knew this tech, knew its maker wasn't bluffing. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of their mistake. Outside, the night was no longer still. Police cars lined the street, their red and blue lights pulsing through the trees, casting eerie patterns on the mansion's facade. Ellen, the neighbor who'd called 911, stood with a small crowd of officers, her arms crossed tightly against the chill. She pointed at the mansion, her voice low as she spoke to a young cop. "Karoline's always been private, a recluse, you know, never leaves that place." The cop nodded, scribbling in his notebook, but his eyes were on the house, where faint lights flickered through the windows. A blurry photo, snapped by another officer, was already circulating online, showing the thieves trapped in the hallway, their faces lit by the laser grid. Social media buzzed with speculation. Some called it a prank, others a high-tech takedown. But Ellen knew better. She'd seen Karoline's quiet strength, even if only from a distance. Karoline's voice cut through the mansion's speakers again, cold and unyielding. "Drop your tools, or the grid tightens." The words were a command, not a request, and they hit the thieves like a physical blow. Al had already complied, but Jenna hesitated, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She looked at Vince, searching for the confidence he'd always carried, but found only fear in his eyes. Slowly, she let her flashlight fall, its beam rolling across the floor. Gary followed, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. Vince stood defiant, his crowbar still in his grip, his jaw set. "You think you've won," he shouted at the camera, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Karoline didn't respond. She didn't need to. The lasers hummed softly, a reminder of her control. In the control room, Karoline's eyes flicked to the locket, its silver surface worn from years of touch. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft but firm. "You don't fight to hurt, Karoline. You fight to protect." She'd built this system to keep her family safe, to guard the life she'd rebuilt after loss. These thieves weren't just stealing objects, they were stealing her peace, her sanctuary, the place where she'd learned to stand again. She could tighten the grid, trap them until the police arrived. But something held her back. Not mercy, not yet, but a need to show them they'd underestimated her, just like so many others had. If you've ever been dismissed because you seemed ordinary, this moment is for you. Outside, the young cop, Officer Ruiz, stepped forward, his radio crackling with updates. "She's got them pinned," he said to his sergeant, his voice tinged with awe. "Karoline Leavitt. She's not just Victor's wife. She's the one who designed this." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing at the mansion. "You sure about that?" he asked. But Ruiz nodded, pointing to his phone, where the viral photo was gaining traction. Comments poured in, some praising the tech, others marveling at the woman behind it. Ellen overheard, her lips pressing into a thin line. She'd always known Karoline was more than she seemed, but she'd never said it out loud. Now, standing among the police, she felt a quiet pride, a sense that she should have spoken up sooner. Inside, the thieves huddled closer, the laser grid unyielding, their flashlights useless against its glow. Vince's defiance flickered, his crowbar trembling in his hand. "We can still get out," he said, but his voice was weaker now, almost pleading. Jenna shook her head, her eyes fixed on the camera. "She's not letting us go," she said, her voice breaking. Al sat on the floor, his head in his hands, muttering apologies to no one. Gary's gaze didn't waver, his mind racing with the realization that they'd walked into a trap they couldn't outrun. The sirens were louder now, the police just minutes away. Karoline's fingers hovered over the touch screen, her next move a question only she could answer. The lasers pulsed faintly, and the mansion seemed to hold its breath. What would she choose? The Leavitt mansion's hallway plunged into darkness as the laser grid vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the thieves' flashlights. Trembling in their hands, the heavy oak doors remained locked, their bolts unyielding, trapping the group in a void that felt alive with judgment. Vince's bravado had shattered. He stood in the center of the hallway, his crowbar long abandoned, his voice raw as he screamed into the emptiness. "We're sorry, we'll leave." I swear his words echoed off the walls, unanswered, swallowed by the mansion's vast silence. Karoline watched from her control room, her face unreadable, the silver locket now clasped in her hand, its cool metal grounding her. Her thumb traced her mother's initials, a quiet tether to the strength that had carried her through loss, through doubt, through years of being unseen. She wasn't angry, not anymore. This was about something deeper, something she needed to finish. Jenna sank to the floor, her back against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her knees. "We're done," she whispered, her voice breaking, the weight of their mistake crushing her. Al sat beside her, his head bowed, muttering apologies to no one, his broad frame deflated. Gary, ever the quiet one, stood apart, his flashlight pointed at the floor, his eyes distant, as if he'd already accepted their fate. The cameras above them swiveled, their lenses glinting in the dark, a constant reminder that they were watched, judged. Vince paced, his shouts growing desperate. "Just let us go," he pleaded. But the silence that followed was louder than his voice, heavier than the locked doors. Karoline's monitors showed every angle of their defeat, their fear laid bare, and she felt a strange calm, a certainty that this moment was hers to shape. Outside, the night buzzed with activity. Police cars lined the street, their lights casting a frenetic glow across the mansion's lawn. Officer Ruiz, the rookie cop, stood near Ellen, the neighbor who'd called 911, his radio crackling as he spoke to his chief. "She's not just a victim," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "Karoline Leavitt, she's in control." Ellen nodded, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the mansion. She'd always thought Karoline was different, not just another wealthy recluse, but she'd never said it aloud. Now, as the crowd grew neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers, she felt a quiet regret for staying silent so long. Social media was ablaze. The blurry photo of the trapped thieves now a viral sensation, with hashtags praising the mansion mastermind. If you've ever held back when you should have spoken up, this moment is for you. Karoline's voice broke the mansion's silence, ringing through the speakers with a clarity that stopped Vince mid-shout. You thought this house was empty. You thought I was nothing. The words were calm, deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. Every screen in the hallway lit up, playing footage of the thieves' break-in the moment Vince cut the power, the crowbar prying the door, their careless steps into the foyer. The timestamps were undeniable. The images sharp, their guilt captured in high definition. Jenna's tears fell faster, her hands covering her face. Al's muttering stopped, his eyes wide with dread. Gary's flashlight dropped, its beam spinning across the floor. Vince stood frozen, his mouth open, no words left to fight with. The footage looped, a relentless mirror of their arrogance, their mistake. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as police moved toward the mansion, their boots crunching on the gravel drive, handcuffs glinting in their hands. Officer Ruiz led the charge, his radio buzzing with orders to secure the scene. Ellen stepped closer, her breath fogging in the chilly air, her eyes searching the mansion's windows for a sign of Karoline. She didn't know the woman well, but she felt a connection now, a shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated. The viral photo had sparked a wave of support online, with comments praising Karoline's brilliance, her quiet power. And that was when the truth didn't need to shout anymore. Karoline had won, not with rage, but with precision, with the system she'd built from years of unseen work. In the control room, Karoline's gaze softened as she watched the thieves unravel. She could keep them locked in, let them sweat until the police broke through. But a question lingered in her mind: would she show mercy? Her mother's voice echoed, gentle but firm. You fight to protect, not to destroy. These people had violated her home, her peace, but they were broken now. Their arrogance stripped away. She thought of her daughter, grown and far away, and the locket in her hand, a reminder of the love that had shaped her. She could end this with a final trap, or she could let justice take its course. Her finger hovered over the touchscreen, the choice heavy but clear. The police were at the door now, their knocks echoing through the mansion. The screens kept playing, the footage a silent accusation. What would Karoline do with the power she held? The Leavitt mansion's hallway was quiet now, the heavy oak doors unlocked, swinging open as police officers moved through with steady purpose. The thieves were led out in handcuffs, their heads bowed, their flashlights and tools left scattered on the polished wood floor. Vince's face was pale, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Jenna's cheeks were streaked with tears, her hands trembling as an officer guided her forward. Al and Gary followed silently, their shoulders slumped, the weight of their defeat etched in every step. Outside, the night was alive with flashing police lights, their red and blue pulses cutting through the darkness, illuminating the crowd that had gathered on the lawn. Karoline emerged from her control room, the silver locket still clasped in her palm, its familiar weight steadying her. Her eyes were tired but resolute, her face softened by a quiet strength that hadn't faltered. She stepped into the foyer, the air cool against her skin. The mansion's vastness no longer a trap, but a sanctuary reclaimed. Officer Ruiz, the rookie cop who'd first praised her control, approached her cautiously, his hat in his hands. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost reverent. Karoline nodded, her lips pressing into a faint smile. But a single tear slipped down her cheek, not for the thieves, not for the chaos, but for the memories this house held. Her mother's laughter, her daughter's first steps, The nights she'd spent building this system to keep them safe. She brushed the tear away, her fingers tightening around the locket, its engraved initials a silent vow to keep going. If you've ever fought for something no one else could see, this moment is for you. Outside, Ellen, the neighbor who'd called 911, stood among the reporters, her voice steady as she spoke to a young journalist with a notepad. "She's always been more than they thought," she said, her eyes on the mansion's open door. "Karoline's not just some rich man's wife. She's the one who made this place what it is." The journalist scribbled furiously, the crowd murmuring in agreement, their phones capturing the scene. Social media was still buzzing. The viral photo of the trapped thieves now joined by new images, Karoline stepping out, her face calm, her presence undeniable. Comments poured in, calling her a hero, a genius, a woman who'd turned the tables on those who'd underestimated her. Ellen felt a pang of guilt for never reaching out, for assuming Karoline preferred her solitude. She'd been wrong, and now she wanted to make it right. Karoline's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her breath catching at the name on the screen. Victor. He was overseas, halfway across the world, but his voice came through thick with pride. "You didn't need me," he said, a faint chuckle in his tone, but she heard the emotion beneath it. "You never did, Karoline." She closed her eyes, a warmth spreading through her chest. Victor had always believed in her, had given her the space to build this system, but tonight was hers alone. "I needed to do this," she said softly, her voice steady. "For us, for Mom." The line was quiet for a moment, and she knew he understood. The locket in her hand felt lighter now, its weight no longer a burden but a reminder of love, of resilience. The thieves' excuses faded as they were loaded into police vans, their voices drowned out by the crowd's whispers. Karoline's name, spoken with awe, with respect. Vince tried to mutter something about a mistake, but no one listened. Jenna's sobs were muffled. Al's head hung low, and Gary stared straight ahead, his silence louder than any defense. The truth settled over the scene like a fog lifting. Karoline had protected her home, her legacy, not with anger but with the quiet power of preparation. "You didn't make trouble, Karoline. You were in trouble, and you stood tall." The night felt lighter, the air softer, but her heart carried a quiet weight, a mix of relief and something deeper, something like grief for the battle she'd fought alone. Officer Ruiz lingered nearby, watching as Karoline spoke to another officer, her voice low, composed. He'd heard the stories online, seen the comments praising her, but what struck him was her calm, the way she carried herself like someone who'd faced worse and come through. He thought of his own mother, a woman who'd raised him alone, always underestimated, always stronger than anyone knew. He wanted to tell Karoline that, but the words didn't come. Instead, he nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement, and she returned it, her eyes meeting his for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. The crowd began to thin, the reporters packing up, but the story was far from over. It was spreading, growing, becoming something bigger than one night. Karoline stepped back into the foyer, her gaze lingering on the family portrait on the wall. Her, Victor, their daughter, smiling in a moment long past. She'd fought for this, for them, for the life she'd built from the ashes of loss. The locket in her hand felt warm now, a piece of her mother's strength carried forward. The police were wrapping up, their radios crackling with final reports. But one question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. She'd won, but at what cost? The night was nearly over, the mansion quiet again, but something had shifted, something that would linger long after the lights went out. What would tomorrow bring for a woman who'd shown the world who she was? The first light of dawn crept over Long Island, painting the Leavitt mansion's stone facade in soft golds and pinks. Karoline stood on the front porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls against the cool morning air. The mansion behind her was silent once more, its grand halls and locked doors no longer a battlefield but a home. Reclaimed, she wore a simple sweater, her hair loose, the silver locket now tucked into her pocket, its weight a quiet reminder of the night's battles, some won, some lost, all carried in her heart. The police vans had gone, the crowd had dispersed, and the flashing lights that had lit the night were just a memory. But the world felt different now, as if the air itself held the echo of what had happened here, across the street. Ellen stood in her own yard, watering her roses, her eyes drifting to Karoline's porch. She'd stayed up late, talking to reporters, her voice steady as she told them about the woman who'd outsmarted a gang of thieves. "She's not what you think," Ellen had said. Her words replayed on morning news shows across Long Island. The story had spread, sparking debates about women in tech, about the quiet strength that often went unseen. Social media carried Karoline's name far beyond the neighborhood, with posts praising her ingenuity, her resolve. One comment, shared thousands of times, read simply, "She didn't need to shout, she just let the truth stand tall." Ellen felt a swell of pride, but also a pang of regret. She'd never knocked on Karoline's door, never offered a neighborly coffee. Now, she wanted to change that. Karoline sipped her coffee, her gaze on the horizon where the sun was climbing higher, its light softening the edges of the night's chaos. The thieves faced charges now, their viral heist a cautionary tale that had already made headlines. Vince, Jenna, Al, and Gary, names she'd learned from the police reports, were no longer threats, just people who'd made a terrible choice. She didn't hate them, didn't wish them harm. They'd thought her home was an easy mark, thought she was nothing more than a shadow in a rich man's life. They'd been wrong, and now they'd carry the consequences. She thought of her mother, whose voice still guided her. "You don't fight to destroy, Karoline. You fight to protect." That was why she'd built the system, why she'd stayed in the control room, why she'd faced them down, not for glory, but for the life she'd built here. Her phone buzzed, a message from her daughter, Claire, who'd seen the news from her apartment in Boston. "Mom, you're incredible," it read, followed by a string of hearts. Karoline smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest, but her eyes stung with unshed tears. Claire was grown now, living her own life, but this house held her childhood, her laughter, the moments Karoline cherished most. Protecting it had been more than a duty, it had been a promise to her family, to herself. She replied with a simple, "Love you," her fingers lingering on the screen. Victor had called again at dawn, his voice softer this time, promising to be home soon. "You changed something tonight," he'd said, and she knew he meant more than the headlines. Ellen crossed the street, her watering can left behind, her steps hesitant but determined. She stopped at the edge of Karoline's lawn, her hands clasped in front of her. "Karoline," she called softly, and Karoline turned, her expression open, curious. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I never came by before, and I'm proud of what you did." Karoline's smile widened, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Ellen," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe come by for coffee sometime." Ellen nodded, her throat tight, and turned back. A weight lifted from her shoulders. That small exchange, that quiet offer, felt like a new beginning, a ripple from the night's events. The news vans were gone, but the story lingered. Local stations ran segments on Karoline's brilliance, interviewing tech experts who marveled at her security system. A petition, started by Ellen, circulated online, calling for better community security measures. Inspired by Karoline's resolve, it had hundreds of signatures by noon, a testament to the impact of one woman's stand. Karoline didn't give interviews, didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than any press conference could. She stepped back inside, closing the door softly, the locket now resting against her heart. She wasn't here to prove herself, she was here to protect what mattered. And she'd done that. The world kept turning, but something had shifted. There's a kind of justice that doesn't need noise, a kind that grows from standing firm, from building something unbreakable. Karoline's story lingered, a whisper of truth that echoed louder than any shout. It wasn't about the thieves, or the headlines, or even the system she'd built. It was about a woman who'd been underestimated, who'd carried her grief and her strength in equal measure, and who'd shown the world what she was made of. As the sun climbed higher, the mansion stood quiet, its walls holding the echoes of a night that had changed everything. And Karoline, standing in her kitchen, felt a quiet peace, a sense that she'd honored her mother's legacy, her daughter's future, and her own heart. What would grow from this? In the days and years to come. Karoline stood alone on her porch, the dawn's light catching the locket in her hand. Its silver worn but warm. The world moved on, but the quiet of her victory lingered, heavy with meaning. Justice didn't roar, it settled like dust after a storm. Did it need to be louder than that? Sometimes. The truest strength is the kind that doesn't demand a spotlight, just a heart that refuses to break.